Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
A brighter picture has emerged for the state's fiscal future, and the State Economist explains the dramatic shift in the forecast. Plus, lawmakers call for help for former prisoners to regain a place in society and for tax conformity on Paycheck Protection loans. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. Last week, Minnesota Management and Budget presented the much-anticipated February budget and economic forecast.
I feel like we've been on a year-long roller coaster. And we got on this unwelcome ride about a year ago, last February. At the time, the state's economy was running well. We had a budget surplus, low unemployment, and good news all around. The path changed really quickly from there, with a surprising turn just this last fall, when we announced that despite significant economic hardship, the state's budget was in better shape than expected, with a $600 million surplus for the current biennium. However, we were still anticipating a $1 billion shortfall for the next biennium. As you saw in our title slide and our forecast book cover, the sun is beginning to shine. We're showing improvements in both the state economy and the state budget situation. That good news may lead some to think that the wild ride is over. Is the state economy and the budget back to where we were last year? No. Today's revenue projections for the next 2 years still show $450 million less revenue than we'd anticipated previously. And that figure would be much worse if not for the federal action. The state's budget picture also does not include the individual household challenges, harm, shortfalls that we see for many Minnesotans based upon the impact of the COVID-19 virus, both for their health and their pocketbook.
Following the forecast, Governor Walz and legislative leaders responded to the news.
So you see some solid numbers. You see some surplus numbers. You see stability in our economic system. You see a state and a retirement system that is fully funded and solvent. And you see the federal government talking about more help as we move out of COVID. Those are things to celebrate. So when we look at this on these projections and state budget projections, they are not absolutely synonymous with household budgets, because I can guarantee you right now, those hospitality industry workers who were laid off for a portion of this year, who were asked to stay home to protect their neighbors, and those folks that are worried about what happens when eviction moratoriums come to an end, this doesn't change their situation one bit. They're in the same situation they were before that. Or those small businesses that were hit disproportionately hard because of the nature of COVID, and again, asked to curtail their activities that impacted their bottom line. Those still need to be part of how we look forward on this. The good news is, we have the capacity, the tools, and the ability, and a resilient economy that we can start thinking about how do we make sure that budget serves all Minnesotans well.
We have a $1.6 billion surplus. That is an amazing turnaround. It really speaks well of the fact that taxpayers have still been paying taxes and we now have a surplus. We're going to make sure these small businesses that struggled through this whole pandemic, that we have their backs and we take care of them. So that's what we should do. There's a number of other things that we can do, but what we for sure won't do is raise any of the taxes that the governor proposed.
And Speaker Melissa Hortman issued a statement that reads, "Today's forecast is good news, but it's important to recognize that our budget doesn't currently meet the needs of all Minnesotans. Every day, there are Minnesotans who struggle and find it hard to make ends meet, while there are others who have more than enough to get by. We must pull together and make the investments all Minnesotans need to recover from the pandemic and thrive once it's over." Dr. Laura Kalambokidis is Minnesota's state economist, and I spoke with her this week for a better understanding of the underlying trends driving the February forecast and the anticipated economic recovery. In November, the state was looking at a projected deficit of $1.3 billion. Now we've got a projected surplus of $1.6 billion. Why, over the course of 3 months, has there been such a shift?
Thanks for having me here today, and I'm happy to talk about that forecast change. So there are two things that happened. One is that projected revenues are significantly higher than they had been projected in the November forecast, and also that projected spending is lower than what had been expected before. So on the revenue side, two things happened. One, which normally would have been a pretty big factor, but is overshadowed by the second factor. And the first one is that our actual revenues that we've taken in the course of the few months since the last forecast have been higher than what we had forecast. And so that means that it makes sense that the forecast might be increased. But the main reason is that the US economic outlook changed dramatically between November and February. We start with a US economic outlook, and then we build our Minnesota economic outlook from that. And so what's happening in the US affects what's happening in Minnesota. And in November, the US macroeconomic forecasting firm that we use did not include any impacts of any prospective federal fiscal pandemic relief payments. And since then, we've had the $900 billion bill that passed at the end of 2020, and we now have incorporated into the US outlook the expectation of $1.5 trillion more of federal pandemic relief that is expected to pass this month and is expected to start influencing the economic growth this quarter. And so it is a large forecast swing for us in terms of revenues from November to February, but we don't usually see such dramatic changes in federal fiscal policy between November and February.
To that point, the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, Neel Kashkari, has been a proponent of federal stimulus to get the state and the nation through the pandemic. The recovery after the Great Recession was slow. Experts are saying this could be a much faster recovery. Have economists learned some lessons from that recovery versus this and fiscal stimulus at the federal level?
Yeah, I think that economists have learned some things and policymakers have learned some things. So there were some economists during the course of the last recovery from the previous recession who were calling for more stimulus, but there didn't seem to be as much of an appetite for it among the members of Congress who were making decisions about that. But the Fed and economists elsewhere, economists in the Fed and economists elsewhere, have looked at that long stretch. It was a 10-year long, a record long economic expansion with fairly steady but relatively low growth and low inflation. And so the change in the way we look at this is that when you have slack in the labor market, meaning potentially you have people not only who are unemployed, but also a group of people who may be on the bench, so not in the labor market, that you can infuse money into the economy, stimulate the economy maybe more than expected, and not trigger much inflation because you still have to pull people into the labor market. And so the Fed is now given guidance where they're saying that they will allow, they're looking at targets for inflation that they're saying, let inflation stay at or near our target for a sustained amount of time before we'll try to ratchet things back, because we think that there are people on the bench. We think we can bring people into the labor market, and that may be better overall because it will spread that economic opportunity deeper into the labor market.
Many experts have spoken of the uneven nature of the recovery, some calling it K-shaped. Some businesses have thrived, but others, especially in leisure and hospitality, have been devastated. Is it up to policymakers to try to make those devastated industries whole? And what happens if they don't?
Yeah, it's when something happens in the economy that is uniquely affects one particular sector, it's reasonable for policymakers to look to try to support that sector. I mean, this wasn't a sector that lost jobs because of something that those businesses did wrong or they didn't anticipated change in technology, or they misinvested or overinvested. It was something that happened because of a pandemic, that in order to protect the rest of the population, governors around the state restricted activity in those industries. And so I do see why policymakers are eager to support industries that were forced to restrict their businesses in order to protect other people.
Relatedly, there are about 100,000 fewer jobs in Minnesota than in February of last year. There are there are 100,000 fewer Minnesotans who are working now, and 250,000 fewer jobs than February of last year. We used to talk about a labor crunch. How does this affect the future? What has the pandemic done to our workers and our jobs?
Yeah, and it's 100,000 fewer people in the labor force now than last year, and 248,000 fewer jobs. So the initial condition that we started with before the pandemic hit was that Minnesota has an aging workforce and our labor supply was restricted. There have been in the last few years restrictions on international immigration, which had been an important source of new workers in Minnesota. So then the pandemic hit, and that overshadows all of those issues that we had before. We also had economic disparities, and those things didn't change, and those things aren't gone. And when the dust settles from the pandemic, those issues will arise again. So for now, we don't have a tight labor market. We don't have a restricted supply. We have instead, as you said, people who have left the labor force and people who are unemployed and looking for work. So as the economy grows, and it is expected to recover quickly, as the economy recovers, those people are going to be drawn into the labor market, and we will be back to a situation where, okay, now we have an aging population, we have baby boomers who are retiring. What do we do with that situation? The pandemic and the economic downturn are disrupting a lot of aspects of the economy. Things are very different right now than they were a year ago. We don't know exactly how those disruptions are going to play out. So we don't know what all the issues that we'll have to deal with when the economy fully recovers. But we do know that some of those initial conditions are still going to be there.
What about farmers? Last time we talked, farm income was up due in part to direct government payments. So how will the agricultural economy fare as we go forward, do you think?
Yeah, farmer income last time we talked had increased largely because of those big economic payments that were provided last year. And the coming reports are saying that the next set of farm income data is going to show a decline in farm income from that level that was boosted by farm payments. And the decline in farm income is because there's less of those farm payments from the government occurring. Farmers dealt with a lot over the course of 2020. They dealt with supply chain disruptions from their inputs because of the pandemic. There was, if you remember a year ago, there was still significant trade policy uncertainty. Is China going to buy American soybeans? And some things have changed for the better over the course of 2020 for them. China is indeed buying American soybeans in order partly to rebuild their swine herds that were devastated by a swine flu there. In addition, we are seeing farmers that had their cash position improved by federal payments, they are finally, after a number of years of not doing so, they are finally investing in equipment and structures. And so we are seeing some improvement in that area.
Dr. Laura Kalambokidis, I love having you on to dig into this twice a year. I want to thank you for coming on today.
My pleasure.
This week at the Capitol, a bipartisan and bicameral pair of lawmakers promoted legislation to help former prisoners reintegrate into society.
The emphasis on this bill is to remove as many barriers from inmates leaving incarceration so that they could be successful. We want to, I like to say this every once in a while, and it's true today now as it ever was. I like taxpayers. I want people to be productive members of society. I want them to be taxpayers because that is important. It is the way to success. So what we've done here with this bill, and I've worked with corrections, folks with the Department of Corrections are supportive of this bill. What I've done is added a number of different items to the bill to help those who are leaving incarceration to be ready to reintegrate back into society, such as helping them to get a Social Security card, helping the inmates get a copy of their birth certificate, because you're going to need that for any number of purposes once you leave incarceration, making sure they have a photo ID, which will cause there will be a fiscal note for getting people a state photograph ID so that you can use this to do the operations we take for granted in society on a daily basis.
This bill addresses issues that I've learned face people when they're released from incarceration, especially through my work on the Opioid Epidemic Response Advisory Council. These are definitely barriers that we heard through that work. And so, our job is to remove barriers for people and allow them to own up to their mistakes and take care of themselves and loved ones. So this legislation just really asks the Department of Corrections to give Minnesotans some tools they need to be successful upon reentry from incarceration and removes those barriers that people face upon release.
And members of the Senate called for tax conformity with the Paycheck Protection Program.
Those businesses that were hurting, the federal government came up with a plan that allowed them to keep their employees so that they would not lay off employees while there was a shutdown. And so we found that the federal government is not taxing that Paycheck Protection Program, but if Minnesota does nothing, we will be taxing that, and that creates a real burden on some of these small businesses that had to struggle through the shutdowns.
It is true that without action, Minnesota will be taxing the forgiven loans on those businesses that did exactly what the federal government sent the PPP loan dollars to do. That is to keep their employees employed, keep the paychecks going out, even though there were no customers, and keeping those employees employed with paychecks and not on unemployment insurance. And now for Minnesota to not act and then provide an over 9% tax on these forgiven loans would be unconscionable.
The federal government was very, very clear. The Congress explicitly said that these PPP loans that are forgivable should not be taxed, and they made a decision federally to not tax them. Because of a provision in current law in Minnesota, unless we act, they'll be taxed as regular income. That is not what the federal government intended, and I just can tell you, if we don't act, the cost of doing this is about $438 million one time. But the impact of not doing this is when Minnesota businesses start to file their returns, which they'll start to do fairly soon, they're going to have to pay the tax. And the effect of that is $438 million that businesses would have invested in our economy and our economic recovery will not be out there.
The problem of catalytic converter theft isn't going away. In fact, it's only getting worse. Senator John Marty is carrying a bill to disincentivize the activity and to make it easier for law enforcement to prosecute the crimes. I spoke with him a few months ago and began by asking why the thefts are increasing.
Partly it's just a matter of the value of the metals, the catalytic converters, which the catalysts in them are precious metals that help break down the toxic pollutants. And so they require a piece of scrap metal might have $200 worth of scrap metal in it. And the value of those metals have gone up significantly in recent years, and therefore it's a very profitable crime for people. So yes, they have gone up. I think in St. Paul, they have gone up like fivefold in the last 5 or 6 years. and they continue to grow as thieves find it's a quick way to get a couple $100.
You introduced a bill that would make it more challenging for thieves to sell catalytic converters. You introduced the bill in the last regular session. You also introduced it in the most recent special session. What do you have in mind?
Sure. There are several things we're trying to do. One of which is it's all focused on the fact that the people who are stealing these can do it quickly and they can sell them quickly. And some of the scrap metal dealers are in effect fencing operations. They're marketing them to these thieves, saying, here, you can get it quickly and easily, quick way to get cash. And unfortunately, all it takes is one of those Sawzall types of electric saws. You just go slide under a car, a couple of quick cuts. It can take you less than a couple of minutes, and it's well hidden because you're under the car. They do it on street corners. They do it anywhere, in the middle of the night, sometimes in the middle of the day. And so what we're trying to do is block them from happening. Several things in the bill, one of which is we require them to hold the converter for several days before they sell it, so if police or others can go there and check them out. Number two would be requiring them verifiable information on the fact that they're legitimately the owner of the catalytic converter. And the third thing we're trying to do is say scrap metal dealers can't buy them from anyone other than a bona fide business that deals with car repairs. In other words, if I come in off the street corner and say, hey, I got 10 catalytic converters for sale here, and they pay me a couple $1,000 for them, where did I get them? I mean, it's not like people just, oh, I just happen to have a collection of catalytic converters in my basement. No, they're stolen, and very obviously in most cases stolen. So we want to try and make it much more of a hassle.
Who are the victims of these crimes, and and how much does it cost for the repair? How much are these people out, and does car insurance help in any way?
Yes. Well, first of all, car insurance does help, because if you have a $1,000 deductible and it costs you $2,000 to get it replaced, well, it'll boost your auto insurance rates probably, but it also will save you $1,000 on it, because it's typical to be paying a couple $1,000 to get a repair on a catalytic converter. We had one county commissioner from up in Stearns County spoke at our town meeting that we had on this, a community meeting, to get people's ideas on this. He talked about a local nonprofit that had vans for driving people with disabilities. And he said they had a couple of them in their parking lot cut off, and they were like $3,000 each to repair. And so it's hitting nonprofits, it's hitting small businesses, and hitting family after family after family. I've talked to people who have one stolen, they get it replaced, and they get another one stolen. Most of us, fortunately, haven't had this experience, but it's a couple $1,000s out of pocket in most cases.
And it appears that these criminal activities are on the rise.
Yes, they're very clearly rising. As I said, in St. Paul, it's been growing significantly in the last 5 years. And that's not just St. Paul. I hear the same thing. We had this community meeting on catalytic converter thefts, trying to find out stories and things like that. We had a lot of callers from Minneapolis. We've heard from people in the suburbs, everywhere. It's a problem statewide.
According to a Forbes article last year, California requires all businesses to document sales of catalytic converters with a photo or video of the seller. They also require that payment be made by check and to the business or the seller, and that there's a 3-day delay before that check can be picked up if it's not mailed to a specific address. How do you view this approach?
Yes, I think that's a good one. First of all, getting the photograph, requiring that, scrap metal dealers, I believe, already have to do that. So yes, that's a good step. The other thing you just mentioned about California, where they can't pay them right away, they either have to wait 3 days or mail them a check or whatever else. Yeah, that's a good thing. And I think it's something we're looking at adding to the bill, because you don't want to have someone who's just trying to get a couple $100 of quick cash or a couple $1,000 of quick cash to turn in a bunch of these, get the money and run. If they have to wait a few days to get the money, it's just one more barrier to their quick way of getting cash. And I think we ought to be exploring every kind of illustration like that. We had people who suggested, why not try and require the VIN number, the vehicle identification number. Every car in the country has a VIN number on it. Why don't we require them to stamp that on the catalytic converter? That'd be great, but again, that would take years for it to happen. And what about all the cars that have catalytic converters now? there are all kinds of approaches to do this, but we think the simplest and most obvious is to make it harder for the thieves to sell them. And one other thing we have in the bill I didn't mention earlier, we would prohibit an individual like you from just going in and selling a catalytic converter unless it's attached to a vehicle. In other words, the only people who could sell them to the scrap dealers are auto repair shops, muffler shops, things like that, that might have excuse to come across them. Somebody coming in just off the street saying, oh yeah, I just happen to have a bunch of them. I think we start with the presumption that those folks may have stolen property there.
Well, so I have two more questions. Regardless of the remedy to disincentivize the theft of catalytic converters, isn't this whole industry suspect in and of itself? I did an internet search. I found a local business that advertised accurate and competitive pricing. The business also spoke of maximizing profits. So as a regular course of business, who really is selling catalytic converters?
Largely thieves. Any auto dismantling operation, any scrap yard will have a lot of them too. Matter of fact, some of them you look for the price and how much you can get if they take your junker of a car. If they junk your car, how much will they pay you for it? And they ask you for the model number, the year, I mean, things like that. So they know how big the car is, what kind of metal they'll get from it, and so on, what valuable products they might get. And they do say, does it have all major components? And they list the three of them. They list transmission, they list engine, and they list catalytic converter. Catalytic converter is the one they list first because it's the most profitable part of the car. And so, yeah, those folks can have it. But if I'm a scrap metal dealer and I'm getting it from an auto recycling center, it's obvious they may have 30 a day if they junk that many cars. But you or I aren't going to have 10 catalytic converters unless we stole them. There's just no other reason people would do that. We put it in the bill as a total ban on an individual selling, but we'll take it out or modify it if we need to. We haven't heard anybody argue why that's a bad idea yet.
Now, one more question. Is it already illegal to buy stolen property? Could charges be brought against scrap metal dealers, especially if they're buying significant quantities from probably people who stole them?
Yes, I would love to see that happen. The trouble is it's hard to prove. It's hard to prove they were stolen and so on. We're not set up for that. And law enforcement and prosecutors have so many other crimes they're dealing with. This is purely an economic crime. I mean, it can lead to more dangerous things, and it's a huge economic crime. But yes, we can prosecute now if we have the evidence. We're trying to make it easier to, one, get the evidence, and two, put the buyers out of business. If they're crooked scrap metal yards, put them out of business. The honest ones can continue to thrive. The crooked ones, let's put them out of business.
Senator John Marty, I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.